Good afternoon, and welcome to the Washington Institute. May I ask everyone to bow their heads in a moment of silence for all those who perished or were injured by the horrific terrorist attacks in Belgium and Istanbul in the last week. Thank you. My name is Andrew Tabler, the Martin J. Gross Fellow in the Washington Institute's program on Arab politics, and specialist on Syria, or whatever you want to call it now, and that country's regionalized civil war. As Bashar al-Assad has lost control of about 3/4 of his territory, and in the wake of recent terrorist attacks, Kurdish groups in Syria have become a growing point of contention between the United States and Turkey. Washington sees the Democratic Union Party, the PYD, which now holds multiple cantons in Syria across Turkey's southern border, as a tactical ally with a seasoned ground force in the fight against Islamic State forces in Syria and elsewhere. Ankara, on the other hand, sees the PYD as a terrorist group, closely linked to the Kurdistan Workers Party, or the PKK, a U.S., EU, and NATO-designated terrorist organization which the Turkish government is once again fighting at home. In Washington policy circles, Turkey and the PYD seem essential, albeit quite different, allies in the campaign against the Islamic State. Turkey's long border with Syria and its military bases are vital to U.S.-led coalition efforts against ISIS. While more broadly in an environment of tense U.S.-Russian relations, Turkey's armed forces today stand as the second largest in NATO after the United States. At the same time, the PYD and its armed wing, the People's Protection Units, or the YPG, remain thus far one of the most effective ground forces inside Syria in retaking and holding areas from ISIL control, and an emerging force in an increasingly divided Syria. And with the YPG's capture of territory, there are increasing questions of how the United States should engage with the group vis-a-vis Iraqi Kurdish groups, most notably the Kurdistan Democratic Party, or the KDP, arguably the PKK's biggest rival. Where is U.S. policy on the Syrian Kurds headed, and what approach should Washington take going forward? To discuss these and other questions, I'm truly honored to moderate this policy forum, and I think debate of sorts, with Institute scholars who have deep and firsthand regional experience on the question of Kurds and U.S. policy and how the two things might or might not go together. Soner Cagaptay, to my left, is the Beyer Family Fellow and Director of the Turkish Research Program at the Washington Institute and author of The Rise of Turkey, the 21st Century's First Muslim Power. He has also served as chair of Turkey's Advanced Area Studies Program at the State Department's Foreign Service Institute. At farthest left is David Pollock, the Institute's Kaufman Fellow, who has served previously as a senior advisor for the broader Middle East at the State Department. An Arabic and Kurdish speaker, he writes and appears on television frequently regarding Kurdish issues and recently returned from a trip to the Kurdistan region. And last but not least, in the middle, where he usually is Ambassador James Jeffrey, the Philip Solans Distinguished Fellow at the Institute and former U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, Iraq, and Albania.
Thank you.
Sorry, I want to make sure I added that.
The Kurdistan of the Balkans.
He also served as assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor in the George W. Bush administration and as principal deputy assistant secretary for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department. Each panelist will give brief introductory remarks, followed by a free-flowing discussion, and then followed by questions from the audience. And to help you navigate a bit of all of this, please refer to the cheat sheet, which you will find on your table or chairs, which is an excerpt from Ihsan Tharoor's The Middle East Alphabet Soup of Kurds Explained. So without further ado, Soner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, everybody. It's indeed one of our interesting meetings here because this is an exchange of views among institute scholars, and I'm very happy to be part of it. So as Andrew mentioned, you have a cheat sheet on your desks. I'm actually going to use that in a little bit, so if you want to look at that and familiarize yourselves with the groups over there, that'd be useful. So what I thought I would do as while looking at Turkey, U.S. relationship with PYD is really a three-part conversation, very brief. The first is looking at the Kurdish political landscape. The second is looking at what U.S. policy is. And the third is looking at what U.S. policy ought to be. The Kurdish political landscape is very divided, as you see from this list of not inclusive organizations among Kurds in the Middle East. There's about a dozen of them, and there are many more that we haven't included for the sake of brevity. It's a landscape that's divided across the countries. It's a landscape that's divided across languages, of course. So oftentimes it's said that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Kurdish dialects are not languages, but they really are. They're not mutually intelligible. So Kurd in Kobani and the Kurd in Tunceli and the Kurd in Süleymaniye, for example, speak dialects that are as different from each other as Portuguese, Spanish, and French are, maybe even further apart. But those are not the only divisions. The major divisions are political. Various political organizations across the board, starting with Turkey, PKK, which is the most active organization right now fighting the Turkish government. In Syria, there is the PYD, which is also the most dominant political organization over there, has taken over large parts of Syrian territory and declared them as Rojava recently. PKK and PYD both fall under what's called KCK, Group of Communities in Kurdistan. The KCK, which was established by the PKK in 2007 and includes the PKK, also includes the PYD, and PJAK, which is the PKK's Iranian franchise. That's why we gave you the list, because the acronyms after a while get overwhelming. The relationship between PKK and PYD is in the sense that they fall under the same umbrella organization, KCK, and same command structure. I would describe it sort of as similar to the relationship between United and United Express. They're different companies, but you get the same experience. That's where I think PKK and PYD are connected. They also share high command. People in KCK, such as Nurettin Mohammed, Feyman Hussein, and Sabri Ok, are commanders for PKK and PYD at the same time. That's the Turkish-Syrian landscape. Turning to Iraq, there's KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government. That's where things are actually looking good. Turkey has really good ties with KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government. That's now almost a decade-old relationship. It has strong elements of economic cooperation, as well as military and security cooperation. But the driver of it was economic rapprochement, which the Iraqi Kurds initiated and to which Turkey responded positively last decade. Inside the KRG, there is competition between the two major groups, KDP and PUK. And in that competitive relationship, the KDP tends to favor Turkey, and the PUK tends to be more closely aligned with Iran. Informally, I think KRG can be defined as an informal Turkish-Iranian condominium, where Turkey has more leverage on the KDP part and Iran has more leverage on the PUK part. That also explains the KDP's and PUK's differentiated attitude towards the PKK. The KDP is generally more with Ankara on the PKK, so it's more hostile, as well as towards the PYD, which Andrew touched upon, whereas the PUK is a little bit more friendly towards the PKK, also with the Iranian connection with the PKK there, helping make sense of that alignment. In that alphabet picture soup, of course, the most important organization we want to look at today is PYD. That's our debate today, U.S. policy on PYD and what it is. So let me start with what it is, and then I'll look at what it ought to be. Currently, I think U.S. relationship with PYD is a working detente in the sense that it includes a significant amount of compartmentalization. So Turkey is okay with the U.S. working with PYD. I think we have a map. We can put it on the board. There you go. Turkey is okay with the U.S. working with PYD east of the Euphrates, but not west of the Euphrates, in return for which the United States is okay with Turkey killing the PYD from behind, while U.S. works with PYD up front towards Raqqa. So it's a four-way compartmentalization and a constant in-progress sort of working detente. It works. It has worked thus far. I think it has certain pitfalls. Number one, it's susceptible to crises. What if U.S. weapons drop the PYD, end up in the hands of PKK? That would be a disaster, which we would not want to see. Or what if Turkey targeting PYD positions near the border, as per the working detente with the U.S.? also unfortunately targets embedded U.S. troops who are with PYD. We also don't want to see that. So there are obviously a number of pitfalls we want to avoid, and that's not just the worst part of it. It's significantly, I think, Russia's entry into the Middle East is probably the biggest threat to this working détente, in the sense that I don't think Russia's entry is to the Middle East and Syrian war is a blimp. I think it's part of a Russian strategic pivot to the Middle East. And as such, Rojava, the areas controlled by the Kurds, if you can put the map on there again, in the north, areas colored in yellow. Is that yellow from my hair? Yeah, mint green. That's an entity now. I think the Russians have offered them significant military assistance. And for Russia, Rojava offers 3 levers. Number one, a permanent Russian lever inside Syrian politics, not just against various actors on the field, but also against the Assad regime. As Andrew, my colleague, knows very well, Russia's recent announcement of sudden withdrawal of some of its troops from Syria, I think, is in part a reaction to reaction to Assad's position, as the Russians seem to think is too hardliner and too maximalist. So the PYD provides them with a lever in internal Syrian politics. That's number one. Number two, I think Rojava and its PYD-controlled areas provide Russians, if the Russian pivot to the Middle East is a strategic one, with a permanent area for permanent troop placement, including future bases. And of course, number three, I think Rojava provides Russia with a lever against Erdogan, Turkish President Erdogan. Turkey's ties with Russia have taken a nosedive since Turkey downed the Russian plane last November. So much has changed in Turkish foreign policy that Turkey's, of course, relationship with the U.S. had to be recalibrated, because I think the main reason why Turkey was not treated like Ukraine and Georgia were treated when they faced Russia, number one, of course, it has a large and strong army. Number two, because it's in NATO. NATO's utility in Turkey has gone up, but also I think this is really a watershed event in Turkish politics. In fact, I'm going to make up a term now, let's call it after the API, after the plane incident. That's Turkish foreign policy. Having realized that Russia is an emerging threat. And of course, for Russia now, Rojava provides an excellent lever against Erdogan if Russia wants to undermine the Turkish president and also Turkey's internal stability. That's an eventuality I think both the U.S. and Turkey have to work together to avoid. Eventuality being Rojava and the PYD turning into Russia's security clients. That will be a disaster scenario for Turkey. Turkey's Kurdish problem has been and is a domestic issue. And I think so long as it stays a domestic issue, it can be resolved domestically. If it becomes internationalized, if the PYD and Rojava were to become Russia's security clients, Turkey can forget resolving its Kurdish problem, because then the PYD and Rojava will be acting not just according to Kurdish interests, but according to Russian interests. And an analogy in this regard would be Hezbollah's relationship between Iran and Israel. Hezbollah supposedly fights for Lebanese Shiites, but it really fights for Iranian goals. PKK could, or PYD, if it became Russia's security client, could become Russia's Hezbollah against Turkey, fighting Russia's battle and not really Kurds' battle against Turkey. And I think that's an eventuality both the United States and Turkey have to work together to avoid. Which brings me to my final point, what U.S. policy ought to be there for. The ideal would be promoting a Turkey-KRG-style relationship between Turkey and PYD. That's the only way to go forward. That would provide Turkey with a cordon sanitaire against Syrian civil war. I think the utility of Turkish-KRG relationship in providing a cordon sanitaire to Turkey against instability in Iraq is immense. One of the reasons why Turkey was shielded off from the civil war in Iraq is because it has KRG in between Turkish territory and Iraq, and I think the same example can and should be repeated in Syria, especially given the rise of ISIS activity in Turkey and attacks against that country, some of which are coming from Syria or people who have been in Syria. Number two, I think this Turkish-KRG relationship would be good for the U.S. It would provide the U.S. with an ally against ISIS. And for both countries, Turkey and U.S. alike, it would prevent a security connection between PYD and Russia forming, similar to the Hezbollah typology that I used earlier. What are the U.S. levers to get there? United States can encourage Turkey PKK peace. That's very important. Turkey's relationship with PYD often mirrors Turkey's relationship with the PKK, meaning when Turkey is fighting the PKK, Turkish-PYD relationship becomes hostile. because the United Express relationship that exists between PKK and PYD, I think, first of all, you need to break that relationship. To get there, one way of looking at it is to start with the mothership, PKK. If the U.S. can encourage Turkey-PKK peace, obviously that would mean better Turkish-PYD relationship. The United States can also use its leverage with KDP, which can force the PYD to break away and move away from the PKK. The KDP controls the only other route of access into Rojava other than Turkish-controlled territory or ISIS. So that means KDP is really an important avenue of U.S. access and resources of other countries into Rojava. And number three, I think the U.S. should also use its own tactical relationship with PYD to encourage the PYD to move away from the PKK. To the extent that the U.S. can break this Turkish-PYD relationship mirroring Turkish-PKK relationship, it can succeed building a Turkey-KRG-style relationship in there. But before I finish, what is the PKK's role in all of this and where we go from there? I think the PKK has been highly unrealistic in what it has done in the last year. It tried to follow what is called the Kobani model inside Turkey, meaning take over cities, declare autonomy. That failed. The idea that it worked in Kobani, it did because there's civil war in Kobani. It failed in Turkey for two reasons. One, I think the PKK has tried to challenge a very powerful state. The Turkish state has defeated the PKK's attempts to take over towns and declare autonomy. Number two, the PKK also faces its own divided Kurdish political landscape. I went through the list of Kurdish actors in the region. The AKP, too, itself is a Kurdish actor, not in the ethnic sense, but in the sense of regional politics. Although the most powerful Kurdish political party in Turkey's southeast is HDP, that's People's Democratic Party. The HDP is the only other party, but it's also a significant player, getting at 30 to 40% of the vote in Kurdish provinces. So when the PKK launched this offensive to have autonomy or gain autonomy, I think it failed not only because it was trying to challenge the Turkish government, a powerful military, but also because it has a divided audience between two different Kurdish groups. And that's why I think the PKK has lost and will lose if it continues with the current path of trying to wrest areas in southeastern Turkey and declare autonomy. The PKK's challenge, I think, has had two other negative results, largely negative, one of which is that the starting of violence in southeastern Turkey has decimated the HDP, which I've just mentioned in the context of Kurdish politics. So this is Turkey's pro-Kurdish party. For decades, it had a rather small base of about 6% of the electorate. Turkey has a very high 10% electoral threshold necessary for a party to enter the parliament. So the HDP and its predecessors always failed that threshold. In the run-up to the June 2015 elections, the HDP did something unique. They fielded conservative Kurdish candidates in the southeast. So they peeled off conservative voters from AKP. And they fielded liberal candidates in western Turkey, so they got liberal Turkish votes. And their support went, therefore, from 6% to 13%. They not only crossed the threshold, but became the third largest bloc in the Turkish parliament, a kingmaker in Turkish politics. The start of PKK violence decimated that hope of HDP to continue to be a kingmaker, because the beginning of violence both scared away conservative Kurds back to the AKP's bosom, and number two, scared away liberal Turks who were turned off by the beginning of violence. So I think the PKK's efforts to wrest autonomy and declare war have actually ended up significantly hurting Turkey's only pro-Kurdish party, HDP, and decimating its hopes to become a party that appeals to all Turks. The PKK may also, by its war, I think, be rewarding Turkey's President Erdogan with an executive-style presidency. Erdogan is now running a new pre-election campaign in the run-up to constitutional amendments or referendum to lead to constitutional amendments. As you know, Turkey's system is a parliamentary democracy. Erdogan is the president. It's now an open secret that he wants to become an executive-style president in a presidential-style system. To get there, he needs amendments to the constitution. His party had only 49.5% of the vote as of the last elections. He needs more. And the base I think he's going for is right-wing conservative base. And so he's going to run a platform, election or referendum platform, and a strongman right-wing platform base. And I think To that end, the PKK might be rewarding him with presidency because they're allowing him to be a tough guy again as he's going against the PKK, and I think that's helping him build a strong right-wing base inside the country. That leaves me with a final couple of words on U.S. policy going forward. I think, and going back to PYD, I think that the PYD continues to be U.S.'s tactical ally unless Washington decides to do something against ISIS or in Syria on its own. That doesn't mean the U.S. is going to make a binary choice between PYD and Turkey. Both are needed, as Andrew said, in the fight against ISIS. The PYD is actually U.S. boots on the ground, for the lack of a word, and Turkey facilitates U.S. cooperation with PYD, meaning, again, if you can put the map over there, it'll be very obvious. PYD-controlled areas are flanked by Turkish territory, Turkish access to Turkish bases, Turkish military assets. As one friend put it for me, U.S. cooperation with PYD now could not be done without Turkey, the way the forces are positioned. So therefore, this could not be a binary choice of picking one or the other. The U.S. needs both PYD and Turkey to continue to do pushback against ISIS in the short term as a tactical alliance until Washington decides to do something against ISIS on its own or go into Syria on its own. But that's not happening for a while. We all know that. For Turkey, PYD will continue to be an enemy until Öcalan and Erdogan start new peace talks. It's that simple. And for Russia, PYD is a strategic ally, especially if Russia gets its way. And that's what I really want to focus about in the Q&A, but I will come to that in a little bit. So thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to come back to your questions and comments later on.
Thank you, Soner. David, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll just stay seated here if that's okay, if you can hear me all right, right? Yeah? So thank you again all for coming, and to the Washington Institute and my colleagues on the panel for engaging in this discussion. I'll say right off the bat that I agree with Soner about the long-term goal, which I think is achievable, which is to encourage or nurture a relationship between Turkey and the PYD, the Kurds in Syria, that will ultimately be similar to, maybe not exactly the same as, the current Turkish relationship with the KRG, with the Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq. In the case of the KRG, there was a historic transformation in relations with Turkey that occurred over just the past 5 years, from outright enemies, with Turkey regularly bombing KRG territory in search of PKK guerrillas. Again, forgive the alphabet soup here, and very distant economic and political ties to the situation today, in which Turkey and the Kurds of Iraq in the Kurdistan Regional Government of that country are the closest of friends, politically, militarily, economically, and in their overall strategic vision for the region and for the Kurdish question writ large. And so I think that is a long-term, achievable, at least in theory or in principle, goal for Turkish relations with the Kurds of Syria as well. However, I disagree with Soner. Since we wanted this to be a debate, I'll throw this out there, that the PYD, the major Syrian Kurdish political party, and its affiliated militias, are, as I think he would have it, a wholly owned subsidiary of the PKK. That is the main Kurdish militia inside Turkey. If you have to use a corporate analogy, I think the relationship is not as between United and United Express. It's more like, let's say, the relationship between the Chamber of Commerce of Virginia and the Chamber of Commerce of Maryland. In some ways, they share some common goals. They share some regional aspirations for development, for prosperity, for who knows what else. But actually, they're rivals. Actually, each one is out after its own geographically defined self-interests. Virginia for Virginia business, Maryland for Maryland business. And that, I think, is what has happened, regardless of past history or ideology or individual personalities. That is what has happened to the PYD in the last 5 years, since the start of the Syrian uprising in 2011. As it has achieved military success and de facto autonomy for the Kurds in Syria, who are its main constituents, the PYD has become more and more separate from the PKK. And in fact, 4 years ago, in July, or almost 4 years ago, in July of 2012, and I was there at the time talking personally with senior Turkish, Kurdish, Arab, and other Syrian opposition and other officials in the region on the borders between Turkey and Syria and Iraq in July of 2012. At that moment, the PYD made a fateful decision that it has stuck to ever since, through thick and through thin, through ups and downs in the Turkish-PKK relationship. The PYD decided in July of 2012, with some help and encouragement from Masoud Barzani, the president of Iraqi Kurdistan, that it would no longer be an enemy of Turkey, that the PYD would not only not fight against Turkey from across the Syrian border, it would not help the PKK fight against Turkey. And the PYD has kept that promise. Now, I know that the Turkish government doesn't believe that and doesn't believe me, but that is the truth. And in fact, after several hours of listening to high-level Turkish intelligence officials present their data about the smuggling of weapons and drugs and money across the Syrian-Turkish border, which they blamed on the PYD, right, which they blamed on the Syrian Kurds, I pointed out to those Turkish officials that what their maps and charts and statistics actually show is that the only place along the Turkish-Syrian border where drugs and weapons and money are not being smuggled, are the border areas controlled by the PYD. It's actually in the no man's land, in the so-called Azaz corridor along the Turkish border that is not controlled by the PYD. That's where drugs and money and weapons are being smuggled. Because the PYD today is actually, if not a friend, it is a protector of Turkey, or a potential partner of Turkey in securing the Syrian-Turkish border against the PKK, against ISIS, against other threats to Turkey's security. If only the Turkish government could see it that way, then I think we could all benefit, and we can probably help make that happen. So now I want to talk very briefly about a few other points. The title of this session is the PYD, or the Syrian Kurds, whose ally are they? It's just as good to think about this in a sort of inverse way and ask yourselves, whose ally are they not? And whose enemy are they not, right? The Kurds in Syria, or the PYD. So let me start with the Arabs in Syria. In my view, although, again, many people probably wouldn't agree with it, the PYD is not an enemy of the Syrian Arabs. They represent mainly the Kurds, of course. But in fact, although there have been instances of ethnic cleansing as the PYD has taken over territory and kicked Arabs out, sometimes in the thousands in places like Tel Abyad, in fact, the PYD today has an allied Arab militia of many different names of different brigades and so on, but put together probably amounting to at least 5,000, maybe as many as 10,000 Arabs, Syrian Arabs, fighting with the PYD against ISIS and against other enemies. And the PYD is exceedingly careful. For example, in its declaration of autonomy, which no one else has recognized except, well, no one else has recognized it, actually. Not the Kurds in Iraq, not the Syrian regime, not the U.S., not Russia, certainly not the Syrian Arab opposition. But when they declared autonomy for the Kurdish regions of Syria under PYD control last week, they were very careful. And if you want to read their detailed statement about it, I suggest you do that. Go on to Rudaw, R-U-D-A-W, the Iraqi Kurdish semi-official media outlet, and you'll see a long statement by a senior PYD official saying, we are declaring autonomy not for Kurds in Syria, but for Kurdistan in Syria. In other words, just as in Iraq, the Kurds there are very careful to say this is an autonomous Kurdistan region, not just for ethnic Kurds, but for everybody who lives here. Arabs, Yazidis, Assyrians, Christians, other minorities, Shabak, Sabians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just for Kurds. And I think that largely, not completely, the PYD has stuck to that commitment to be relatively tolerant of other ethnicities and ethnic or religious minorities in the territory that it already controls and in new territories that come under its control. Let me talk for just a moment about PYD relations with the organized Syrian Arab opposition. The truth is that those relations are terrible. Unfortunately, tragically, actually. Had they been united or at least friendly, I think the Syrian opposition could have achieved quite a lot more against the terrible regime of Bashar al-Assad and its terrible allies in this fight. But the Arab opposition has been unwilling to recognize any Kurdish ethnic rights in Syria. Not just federalism, but any specific recognition of a Kurdish ethnic identity, although they have had token ethnic Kurds at the head of Syrian opposition, Arab opposition bodies. They have been unwilling to cross what they see as a red line. Now, I understand, to some extent, the reasoning behind it, but I disagree with it. They claim that the PYD is actually not against the Assad regime enough, right? It's a kind of tacit ally or partner of the Assad regime. They claim that recognizing Kurdish ethnic rights in Syria could lead to the partition of the country. But both of those claims, I think, are largely, again, nothing here is 100%. They're largely false. And I happen to know that if you talk privately to leading Syrian Arab opposition commanders and political leaders, almost half of them today will tell you that although they cannot formally recognize, at least so they say, Kurdish ethnic rights in Syria, they do understand that the Kurds, and specifically the PYD and its YPG militia, will have to be included in any future Syrian government after Assad, if there is to be unity and peace ever again within that country. Let me say just a brief word about Syrian Kurdish and especially, again, PYD relations with Russia. The PYD accepts some weapons, some intelligence, and certainly a significant amount of diplomatic support from Russia. That is all true. But it is eclipsed by far by the PYD's interest in, acceptance of, and eagerness for additional American support. And if they can ever get it, additional recognition and coordination with the Arab opposition to the Assad regime inside their country. So that today, the Russians, it is true, are the ones who say that the PYD should be represented in Geneva. And it is the Turkish government who refuses that, and the American government who adopts a kind of hands-off position on that question, at least so far. And in that sense, yes, the PYD, by default, if you like, has become, in part at least, a partner or an ally of Russia. But that is not their first choice, and it is still very limited. And I agree with Soner. It would be tragic if somehow, through inattention or maybe deliberate choice, we pushed the PYD and Russia closer together to the point where, in tandem, they became more of a threat to Turkey or to any of our other friends and allies in the region. I want to just conclude with a few words about some other items on my list. One is the relationship between the Syrian Kurds and the PYD in particular and the Kurdistan region of Iraq. It's extremely complicated, but the basic bottom line here is that just as I argued in the beginning of my remarks, Kurdish political and military interests have diverged geographically in the last 5 years so that the PKK and the PYD are not the same anymore. So too with the Syrian Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds. The relationship between them is rather distant. depending on exactly when and exactly which part of Kurdistan and which party that you're talking about and so on, but without getting into all those gory details, they don't have a whole lot to do with each other. They don't fight together for the most part. There are exceptions, again, in Kobani and Sinjar and so on, but small-scale, short-term, limited exceptions. And they don't coordinate their policies very much. And in fact, if there's one thing to take away from my remarks, it is this. The Kurds have abandoned a pan-Kurdish political project. They have made that choice. The Kurds in Iraq are out for Kurdish interests in Iraq. The Kurds in Syria are out for Kurdish interests in Syria. The Kurds in Turkey are out for Kurdish interests in Turkey. If only the Kurds in Iran could somehow, despite the regime's oppression, be out for Kurdish interests in Iran, but it's just not realistically possible. But in the other places where there is a realistic prospect of autonomy, or at least ethnic rights, the Kurds are looking to secure those rights, each in their own country, each within the boundaries of the much-maligned Sykes-Picot Agreement, which still stands as far as the Kurds are concerned today. So let me say one last word about U.S. policy. Thank you for your patience, Andrew, and all of you. I think that U.S. policy, as Soner described, and here I don't disagree with anything that he said, U.S. policy has moved in a remarkably quickly, and I would say in this case successfully, in the direction of better coordination with the Kurds in Syria and in Iraq, in the common interest of fighting against ISIS. There's still a way to go in this regard, and I agree with Soner that it would be very important for the United States, essential for the United States, to look after not only its interests and its affinity with the Kurds, but also with the Turks and with the Arabs in this common fight. And I do think that that kind of squaring the circle, if you like, is actually, in this case, for once, miracle of miracles, is actually an achievable objective. Thank you.
Okay. David, thank you. Ambassador Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, Andrew. What I want to do is just to augment the last two speakers, Soner and my friend here, David, on the way things look from Ankara and Washington on this set of issues, focusing particularly on the PYD, but on the Kurds in general. And essentially play devil's advocate a little bit and point out the minefields that any way forward that we might think of for us, the U.S., and for our friends, the Turks, might encounter for real. First of all, with the U.S., it's clear that the kind of framework in which the word in the now famous Atlantic interview with President Obama is game plan, that we all have kind of lived under for the last, maybe since 1947, has to be called into question. While in the past, from Carter to Reagan to the two Bushes, we've gone in terms of rhetoric and intensity on tactics back and forth. There have been some basic assumptions that make it comprehensible for us sitting up here or in the media or in academia or elsewhere as citizens to suggest this is what our government should do, because what our government should want is pretty well known. I'm not so sure. Not with this president, and certainly not with one of the two leading candidates for president in 2017. So that has to hang over us to some degree, and we have to be a bit more cautious in the assumptions we make about what particularly this government, what this administration is going to be, what's going to ring its bell, so to speak, and to some degree the next one. On the other hand, one of the benefits of this business is we can always propose what the United States should be doing, even if we're less sure that we'll get that happy result. With the U.S., this is another one of these problems from hell, because it is pushing President Obama to get ever more engaged in a military operation, which yesterday led to another Marine killed, in an area where he doesn't really believe in it, with a tool he doesn't really like, the military, and for a group of people who even we who've been working for 30 or 40 years have to take up one of these things to figure out just exactly the P and the K, because there are mainly P's and K's in here. A few Y's and D's, but mainly P's and K's. It's a very confusing scenario. To the extent that where we are now, two things are as clear as they can be. First of all, President Obama personally took a decision to get more serious about ISIS back at the time of the San Bernardino and particularly Paris bombings. And the events in Brussels will simply further accentuate that. This is a problem he knows he can't go away from. The problem is he is very, very unwilling to deploy the necessary forces to own the problem in the way that we've seen in the past, or over-own the problem, which we've also seen in the past. Thus, the Marine who was killed yesterday was part of a unit that supposedly wasn't even counted against our personnel. But we're used to that at this point. But to get back to the problem, ISIS has to be defeated militarily. There's all sorts of mumbo-jumbo about combating violent extremism, which is important in dealing with the underlying problems that fuel ISIS. But right now, ISIS's threat, which is keeping a couple of 100,000 troops mobilized in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan and Iraq itself, and millions of internally displaced people, that's basically a military problem, because these guys have an army, they have money, they have a population of somewhere between 4 and 6 million. So to take these guys down, it's a military problem. And the closest thing we have to a military solution, apart from bombing, which never accomplishes anything other than play a supporting role, is to find ground troops. If we're not going to use ours, the only ground troops we found who are really successful in a broad way against ISIS have been Kurds, Peshmerga Kurds in Iraq, and the PYD, the YPG Kurds in Syria, and a few of their allies, with bits and pieces of the Iraqi army. The Golden Lions counterterrorism force and a few other groups are exceptions. Those are the only forces who have been able to consistently take terrain back from ISIS. Whether they're going to continue to be able to do that in Arab areas, I'm a bit less skeptical, a little bit more skeptical than you are, David. But I think that under the right circumstances, that's a possibility, and it will be enticing to the administration, because it does want to see progress against ISIS. That's the primary interest it has. The second interest is it doesn't want to see borders screwed with by anybody, because that just generates even more disintegration of the entire, in the last few years we all throw out the word Westphalian system, but even to this administration, that will raise eyebrows and be worrisome, because no one can say where it all ends if it starts, and it's just another mega headache. So there'll be a real interest in maintaining borders. Thirdly, there is a vague interest in seeing Turkey do the right thing. There are remnants of the very strong relationship President Obama had with President Erdogan back in 2009, 2010, 2011, but much of that is dissipated. But nonetheless, Turkey keeps on popping up as such an important country in so many different ways. You look one way and they shoot down a Russian plane. You look the other way and they're negotiating somewhere between a treaty and a blackmail deal with Europe to control the fates of millions of refugees, violating international law, UN guidelines, and everything else. Turkey is a big player. And Turkey poses a real problem for any of the scenarios we're looking at for the PYD, because I can't understand really why Erdogan has taken the position he has taken with the PYD. I understand the PKK. He was shocked by the June elections, where when he made it, his future. 60% of the Turkish population said, sorry, we don't want that, Pasha. We don't want you to be the next Ottoman emperor. And so he had to create chaos to get people frightened for their economic and security futures to turn to a strong man, a traditional tale in Turkey and many other places, and he's the only strong man standing, believe me, in Turkey. So that's why he did what he did with the PKK, and the PKK is the willing accomplice of Erdogan, because the PKK guys sitting in Kandil Mountains have never been all that happy with even Öcalan's position sitting in a Turkish prison, let alone HDP as a potential political rival. So the PKK gladly went back to the role of being an insurgent group and waging war throughout southeastern Turkey. Erdogan, again, has benefited from this, as we saw in the 1 November elections. But the interesting thing is he immediately, even before to some degree with Kobani, but in the end with Kobani, he relented a little bit. He let the Peshmerga travel through Turkey to reinforce the Kurds in Kobani. And there was a possibility of a way forward of the sort we had pointed out. But beginning after the June elections, he has painted the YPG in the same terms as the PKK. And the interesting thing is he's done this repeatedly with the U.S. government, even though he knows how reliant the U.S. government is on these guys to make progress in eastern Syria against ISIS, and even though he knows, as David said, that there is no evidence of the Syrian Kurds, other than rhetorically, supporting the PKK. Now, it's true that in his various trips to Ankara, Muslim, the leader of the YPD, refused to renounce officially the links with the PKK. But hey, we all live in the Middle East. Nobody's willing to officially and formally renounce their links with anybody. That's the nature of the region. At best, you get an 80% de facto distancing. And the Turks wanted 100%. That's typical with the Erdogan government when they really don't want to do something but simply want to put the blame on somebody else. He somehow sees the YPD as necessary to present Kurdism, minus the KRG, his last remaining friend in the region, as a fundamental threat to the Turkish state, thus requiring a maximum leader to deal with that threat. The PYD plays that role because if you look at the map, if you look at the border, almost the entire southern border of Turkey abuts Kurdish Syrian territory. So you're outflanked. You've got the PKK as an insurgent movement in the southeast, and now not only in the mountains, but functionally in the cities as well. And you've got this quasi-army occupying most of your southern border, all the way to Hatay province. That's right, abutting the Mediterranean. So this is a real threat if you're a Turk looking at the future of your country being torn apart by essentially what could become a civil war. That's what Erdogan is playing for. That's going to make it very, very difficult for him to accept any of the scenarios we would like him to see. Either a deal with the PKK, which of course was totally doable a year ago, and nor even a deal with the YPD, which these guys were all talking about as late as 9-10 months ago. So absent a change of heart on Erdogan's part, and nothing is more important to this guy than obtaining essentially dictatorial powers in Turkey, come what may. And he's and his country is paying a hell of a price right now for his policies. We're not going to get the kind of scenario that would allow us to do this kind of manipulating that. If the U.S. government really was in a mode to do it, it might be able to do. So having cast cold water on ideas that in and of themselves I think are good, I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. So just to get this conversation started a little bit, maybe we'll go down to the maybe more specific and then move up to the larger regional level. So in terms of looking at, essentially we're talking about here about, how should we consider the PYD, the YPG, and are there opportunities for the United States and its allies to work with them or not? And so if we look at similar situations in the past, when members of umbrella organizations, and umbrella organizations are key in the Syrian conflict, not just on the Kurdish side, but on the Sunni Arab opposition side. In these cases where they're brought in from the cold, and here I'm thinking, we have to look at these cases like, for example, the PLO's renunciation of terrorism and other violence, recognition of Israel's right to exist, et cetera, et cetera. So what kind of PYD, PKK positions or policies would have to change in order for the U.S. or Turkey or its allies to work more fully with them? Anybody who'd like to take the first?
Look, my own view about that is that I'll leave the PKK out of this, right? And just focusing on the Syrian Kurds and the PYD. My argument is that the PYD has already done that. It's just that the Turks don't agree with it or accept it. And the PYD has already announced that it is not going to fight against Turkey and it is not going to help the PKK fight against Turkey. And that should be, I know it isn't, and I know it won't be for Erdogan anytime in the foreseeable future. That, in my view, should be sufficient for the Turks to say, okay, we've got a deal, or let's make a deal about Syria, not about Kurds in Turkey.
But I understand that in your presentation, and I thought you put it in a good way about looking at these rivalries, that actually the PYD is a rivalry, is a rival for the PKK. So what kind of rivalries are we talking about here? Are we talking about individual rivalries between individuals? Is it movements, sub-movements, cross-border? What kind of rivalries?
Maybe I shouldn't have said rival. I should have said separate. The PYD has overwhelming, overarching interest in the future of the Kurds in Syria, not in Turkey. And the PKK has whatever interest it has, but let's leave that aside because the PYD doesn't want to be responsible for or entangled with what happens to Kurds in Turkey.
Okay. Soner?
Yeah, I'll just weigh in two things. First, within the context of the Syrian civil war, I think what has made it difficult for the United States to work more openly and collectively with the PYD is that the PYD has thus far been co-belligerents with the Assad regime. Not fighting the Assad regime, but acting in concert with the Assad regime. If I can get the map on the board again. So if you look at the upper left-hand corner of the map, there's a green area surrounded by all red. That's all Assad regime areas. Assad was not in control of these areas until very recently. The belt in the north, the red connecting Assad areas to Kurdish control, PYD controlled areas, fell into the regime's hands after Russian deployment and with Russian backing of airstrikes. And the area to the north of that was captured by the PYD with Russian airstrikes as well. So clearly the PYD has been co-belligerents with the Assad regime, not allies, co-belligerents in this war. And I think that makes it difficult for Washington to promote a more open alliance with this group because obviously it doesn't look very good when you're trying to fight the Assad regime and you're also working with guys who are not fighting with them, against them. That's, I think, what makes it complicated in the Syrian war. And I think it's also what complicates it for the Syrian Arab opposition to embrace the PYD because the PYD has not openly launched itself in the battle against Assad since the beginning of the war there. I think in the Turkish context, PYD is a group that's dominant among Syrian Kurds, and PKK's membership is mainly of Turkish Kurds, but there is overlap, and I think that's where David's argument becomes difficult to defend. The overlap is that there is significant Syrian Kurds in PYD, in PKK rank and file and leadership, and there are Turkish Kurds in PYD rank and file and leadership, and that's what makes it different. The organizational overlap, the falling under the KCK umbrella, is what makes it difficult for these organizations to go their ways. I would love to see them go their own ways, and I think we should encourage that, and there's some levers, as I've discussed in my presentation, but we're not there yet because of the overlaps. And I think another reason why the overlap may be difficult to break is because of what's called the Kobani effect, right? So Turkish Kurds are crossing into Syria to fight with PYD against ISIS, and they're coming back, of course, having been indoctrinated into PYD more than they would have been otherwise. And I think the more that kind of crossing of the border continues back and forth, the more it's going to be difficult to emotionally break the PKK and PYD apart. I think right now, in sense of organizational structure and emotional context, they're really not apart as we see it.
Yeah. I think the PYD, to cooperate more closely with Washington, simply has to find a political military way to advance further into Syrian Arab territory. And that isn't just working with the, SDF. It's working with finding a way to work with local Arab tribes and communities in the region to the north of Raqqa. To the extent it can do that, that's the first precondition. The second precondition is, I think the U.S. does have a red line about operating in that area on the map where you see ISIS along the Turkish border. Because the Turks have said we will not tolerate the PYD in that area, and they've shown through their artillery strikes how they'll react. I think that in order to avoid more of a mess in the region, Washington will try to rein them in. If they can show, however, a more effective way to drive forward against ISIS, they'll get more U.S. support. That's why we've got the training teams on the ground. That's why we've got the little makeshift air bases. This is where the administration is pointing. I don't think the administration cares whether these guys really are in the same tent in some areas with the Assad regime, because I don't think that's a priority for us. Defeating ISIS, or at least pushing ISIS back and looking like we're on the path to defeating ISIS, is an important objective. And in Syria, we have nobody else to do it with but the PYD, so YPD. So there we are.
I mean, I just want to take exception with the greatest respect to comments by anyone that argues that the PYD is a quote-unquote co-belligerent, or whatever you want to call it, with the Assad regime. I think that is simply not the case. I think that the PYD is out for its own interests in Syria, and there is no evidence that it is helping the Assad regime, militarily or otherwise, in any way. It has distanced itself from the Assad regime since the start of the rebellion, not by actively fighting against it, that's true, but by taking over whatever territory the Assad regime forces have been either voluntarily or otherwise inclined to vacate, and then maintaining their own control over that territory. And in some cases, they've done that in direct conflict with Assad's forces or with those of his allies. And so this notion that somehow the PYD is tainted by being complicit or a collaborator or something like that of the Assad regime, I think is simply a red herring, completely false, and should not play a part in our U.S. calculations about it, and ideally not in Turkish or Arab opposition or other people's calculations about it. I know that is, unfortunately, not how the Arab opposition on the whole sees the situation, and perhaps not in Turkey as well. But I think those are the facts. When it comes to another question that was raised about whether or not the PYD is making, as I think Jim was suggesting, making enough of an effort to collaborate with Arabs against ISIS. I think they are trying very hard to do that, and they have actually succeeded in, as I said, in mobilizing what started out as just a fiction or a fig leaf, allied Arab militias, but is now a significant military and also political force. And they have done that despite the Arab opposition's insistence that it wants to have nothing to do with the PYD and only deal with individual Kurds or with other Kurdish political parties that have very little sway in Syria, that are part of the KNC, another acronym that we didn't put on the list, but the Kurdish National Congress of non-PYD Syrian Kurdish parties. And finally, I want to say something about individuals. Without, necessarily naming names, although I'm fully prepared to do that, yes, it's certainly true that there are individuals, even hundreds of individuals, of Syrian Kurds fighting with the PKK in Kandil or elsewhere, or of Turkish Kurds fighting with the PYD. But individuals do not a political party or a political policy make, in my view. That is not a sufficient basis on which to say that the PYD as an organization is the same as or subordinate to the PKK or shares the same goals with it. If individuals choose, whether they're from Syria or from Turkey, to fight with one or another organization, that doesn't make the organization, I think, responsible for that kind of identity politics. And I think it would be a terrible mistake, it is a terrible mistake, for the Turkish government to see it as somehow erasing what is, in my view, a very real and beneficial for Turkey line between the PYD and the PKK that has developed, I admit, only in the last 5 years. But let's leave history behind us and let's look forward.
Soner?
Jim?
Sorry.
Just an interjection. Why is it, given the degree of cynicism we have in this region, why is it a mistake for Turkey? I mean, the sense of this panel is everybody should, get together and, cut deals, and all of the people who are halfway on our side, if they all pulled together, we would be a happy group and we would defeat the long list of enemies we have in the region. But as I said, I think I'm relatively accurate in this, Erdogan's interest, Obama's interest is defeating ISIS. Erdogan's interest is becoming dictator for life. Everything is subordinate to that. To the extent that the PYD, whether they deserve it or not, putting them in the camp of the PKK is essential to Erdogan's goal. So why is it a big mistake for him not to be doing this?
Well, for him, it's not a mistake. For Turkey, it's a mistake. For his country, it's a mistake.
Okay.
All right. Let me just jump in. Look, to wish that one day the PKK and PYD are entirely unrelated and therefore you can have autonomous relations with either is one thing. But to say that they are unrelated is another thing, and they are not. Not only rank and fighters, but leadership is shared. Command structure is shared by both organizations. They fall under the same umbrella, mother organization. So it's really hard to say at this stage that they're not separate. There are, of course, distinct in their operational areas. That's why I use the analogy of comparing them to related companies that are owned, but you still that may have different brands and all of that, but still give you the same experience. And I think this is the sense in the region when you talk to PKK and PYD members. Their ideological commitment, their overall goals, their commitment to Öcalan, his ideology. This being a Marxist-Leninist group, there's a huge amount of cult worship going on, and Öcalan is there. I traveled through Syria just before the Syrian uprising hit the country, went to all the provinces of Syria, all 14 of them. I was also in the north. There were more pictures of Öcalan in the north than anywhere else in the world I had seen in public areas. This was, of course, during the Assad regime. The regime supported PKK activity. But clearly, this organization, PKK, has broad appeal within the PYD's base, and I think not as surprising that they overlap. On the other question of PYD's relationship with the Syrian opposition and with the regime, I agree with Jim that it's even less important for the United States now that the PYD is not on board against the regime, because U.S. priority is no more ousting the Assad regime, although maybe we're paying lip service to that. The priority is really defeating and degrading ISIS. But for the Syrian Arab opposition, that's a huge no, because their primary goal is still ousting Assad, as Andrew knows. And I think the PYD are co-belligerents with the Assad regime. They work with it. So if I can have the map on the board again, the areas in the north controlled by the PYD, now you see there are two areas, a large section to the east and a small section to the west. There used to be 3 areas controlled by the PYD, and there was a large Arab-dominated area in the center. The PYD took that area, which was controlled by ISIS. Thank you. But then they also ethnically cleansed it. Not thank you. They cleansed a majority Arab area that's in between the two regions of Kobani and Haseke in the east, so that'd be Tel Abyad. And I think that's ethnic cleansing of Arabs that was documented by various groups, including the International Crisis Group, is the reason why the Arabs have little faith that this can work with the PYD. So the PYD has to show next time they take territory that they will not be ethnically cleansing if they want the cooperation with Arabs to work. And if they're moving in the West, for example, I think the litmus test of PYD's commitment to coexistence with Arabs will be whether they'll tolerate Arab and Turkmens and others to continue in this area. The area west of the Euphrates, which is currently controlled by ISIS, is really a hot flashpoint because it's mixed Turkmen, Arab, and Kurd. And if the PYD were to take that area, I think that the PYD's ultimate goal, it does want to connect its entities. This is an open secret. And I think that's why the Russian intervention is not as benign as David suggested. I think it's more pernicious. Not only does Russia want a long, contiguous entity, a sliver of territory, that it can then promote as an Russian protectorate, in a word of saying, in Syria. So it would be similar to, let's say, Transnistria and Moldova, and I use Transnistria because it looks like it. It's long and narrow. I think Russia wants to unite these entities. Russia wants a united, contiguous territory, and the PYD wants the same thing too. So I think ultimately, what the Russians want in the north and what PYD want is quite similar, and they'll do everything to get it. And but that will, of course, have ramifications because this area, which is ethnically mixed, if it's ethnically cleansed, will only, not only bring actors like Turkey closer in to conflict with PYD, but also PYD's utility, as Jim said, in helping the United States fight ISIS is limited. This is ultimately a Kurdish organization, meaning it can take Raqqa. Yes, it can take this area in between its two entities, but the next day it will be an occupier because it's not these are not Kurdish areas. So I think the group can help the United States, but it cannot go all the way against ISIS. Ultimately, we need Syrian Arabs to go against ISIS.
Okay, we're going to move on to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and someone will come with a microphone. I'm going to throw out the first one just very briefly, and it also is to slug some work that we're doing at the Washington Institute. So recently, we were in a really embarrassing situation where the YPG, which the United States at least indirectly arms and politically supports with airstrikes, ended up fighting groups that are supported, allegedly, according to foreign media reports, by our covert program in Syria, which is designed to target the Assad regime. So in such an environment, is it possible for the United States to really back one faction against another and to parse it out as David was suggesting? Or do we have to get the politics right first and then the rest will follow?
Well, as you might predict, I think the short answer to that is that yes, that happened, but that was a very limited and special and short-lived issue. And for the most part, the YPG has avoided direct clashes with groups that are backed by the United States. There are only very few and very minor exceptions to that rule. And I think that that's generally also the case when it comes to ethnic cleansing. I said in my remarks there have been instances of that, and Tel Abyad is one of them. But and it's very tragic, although perhaps understandable in the context of a civil war. But
I'm sorry, but no ethnic cleansing and understandable.
No, I don't agree with that. I'm not saying it's justified. I'm saying that there are reasons for it. But
you said understandable, which I disagree with.
Okay, that's the word that I said, understandable. And that's what we're here to do, is to try to understand these things, not to explain them away or exaggerate them or somehow cast aspersions about them. So that is the exception that proves the rule. And it is an exception. And in other cases, the PYD and the YPG have quite deliberately refrained from that kind of activity and, in fact, have taken great pains to try and secure Arab support, which, as I said, they have done, I think, increasingly over the last few months to the point where they could probably, with our support, they could probably be a key element in liberating Raqqa and then in administering it afterwards, after ISIS were kicked out, with Arab militias that are their allies. in much the same way that the Peshmerga in Iraq can be a partner in liberating Mosul from ISIS and then turning it over to largely local Arab partners and others.
Okay. Who has the microphone? Okay. Who's first? Oh, I get to pick. Ma'am, here in the front.
Well, thank you very much. Burcu Erdoğdu Tensur, counselor at the Turkish Embassy. There has been lots of discussions about Turkey's policy vis-a-vis PYD, so I think I should say a few words about our approach on that issue. But first of all, I'd like to state very clearly that not just from Turkey's point of view, but based on real facts, and as a matter of fact, known also by the U.S. administration and all other countries that designate PKK as a terrorist organization, is known that PYD and PKK are the same thing. PYD is just the affiliate of PKK in Syria, just as the PJAK in Iran or Tawgari Azadi in Iraq. So they are both part of the same organization. And it's not just the individuals, a couple of individuals, as Mr. Pollock have claimed. As a matter of fact, the commanders, and when you say commanders and the rank and file people, I think it would be difficult to just simplify PYD link with PKK by arguing, just some simple man on the street is just supporting PYD. And all information and documentation and data has been shared with the US leadership at the highest level on PKK-PYD link. And why Turkey considers, why Turkey approaches PYD on a different angle than US does? First and foremost, this very clear, obvious, and real link with PKK, which is a national security threat for Turkey, which has claimed so far more than 40,000 civilian lives since 1980s, and since last January, also conducted 2 big major terror attacks in Turkey that claims more than 100 lives and more than 300 wounded. And the link also with PYD in these terror attacks, bombings, was also clear because, for example, in the latest terror attack that took place in Ankara in March, the one who committed that attack was very recently trained in PYD territory in Syria, and after returning back to Turkey, conducted that terror attack. So that's the national security threat for Turkey, and this is why it's hard to understand for Turkey U.S. position vis-a-vis PYD.
If you could just ask a question, please. Sorry, yeah. I realize, and you're doing a great job of covering the bases here, but is there a specific question you have for...
I will.
Yeah.
I will come to. With regard to the PYD's, apart from being a national security threat to Turkey, PYD's vision vis-a-vis Syria. My question is actually related to that, whether PYD's vision towards Syria is supported by United States or not, whether PYD's recent declaration of federalism is supported by United States, or whether the ethnic cleansing campaign that was conducted by PYD, which was documented by the International Amnesty and Human Rights Watch organization, is approved by the United States or by the discussants here. This was part of my question, but just I'd like to make a final remark. That's the fight against Daesh aspect of the discussions that we held today. First of all, Mr. Pollock portrayed PYD as if the only Kurdish identity in Syria. As a matter of fact, in the Syrian opposition that is represented in Geneva, there is Syrian Kurdish National Congress, which has a support base of more than 625,000 Kurds, Syrian Kurds, who are actually against PYD's policies, merely PYD's collaboration with the Assad regime and Russia and other partners, even Iranian militia, Shashabi group. So there are actually Syrian Kurds within the opposition, which also Turkey supports and gives assistance to. So I just wonder, how do you portray U.S. policy on this
Jim,
issue?
you want to step into the middle of that one?
Sure.
Yeah,
this
sure.
will
Like
be
familiar
fun.
territory.
I need to say something.
Yeah.
Very briefly.
one of my problems in my 4 tours in Turkey was in dealing with the foreign ministry and the Turkish media was that there is a vision of the United States rather like Britain, the vision of Britain at its best days as an imperial power. And while that was never correct, it couldn't be less correct with the current Obama administration. They don't have the foggiest idea how to even answer your questions about, do we consider this autonomous thing? Because once upon a time, say with Gladstone and Disraeli, every single little group from Bulgaria to Tasmania, they had a policy towards, and they were either supporting it or arming it or fighting it or doing it, using it for something. These guys aren't doing anything like that, okay? They see this as a way to fight ISIS, period. Now, to get to the PKK, I'm going to, having lashed out at David a few minutes ago, I'm very close to Soner on the PYD as a sort of offshoot of the PKK, because I used to look at some of the targets of, how shall I say, operations that not just Turkey was involved with in northern Iraq, and I saw that a lot of these guys were actually Syrian Kurds who were running the Kandil Mountains gang. And so I think that they are pretty close together. But that doesn't mean we have to consider them in the United States a terrorist organization. Links with the PKK don't necessarily make you a terrorist organization. This is an important point that I don't think we've ever, at least I never did when I was in the government, because I didn't dare to make it clear to Turks. In the United States, branding something a terrorist organization is tricky if that organization also claims to be a liberation movement. It just is a problem. We're dealing with this in 100 countries. And if an organization embraces, relishes terror, slaughter of innocents as its main operation, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, it's relatively easy. In the case of national liberation movements of any sort, and we've had this problem with Hezbollah, with Hamas and others, we basically take a look at what its goals are, how it targets, what it does, and we exercise a fairly tight, we're careful about that use because we don't want to be accused of doing this just because our friends Turkey and Israel are fighting these people. We want to actually be able to point to real terror. We can do that with the PKK. In good conscience, I can say it's a terrorist organization. I can't with PYD. The fact it has ties with the PKK doesn't make it a terrorist organization. The HDP, which sits with, 60 members of parliament, has ties to the PKK. The brother of the head of it fights with the PKK. So having ties with an organization doesn't necessarily make it a terrorist organization. Again, Turkey has to decide on its own position vis-a-vis the PYD. David said it would be in Turkey's interest to have a different approach. I wouldn't go that far because I've learned over time to be careful about predicting what would be in other nations' interests. The problem is the current government in Turkey is engaged in a very broad, very, very deep conflict with the PKK, and the PYD is seen as part of it. That's a policy decision by Ankara, but that's not a policy decision by Washington.
Let me just, if I may, very briefly. I agree with you that Turkey's interests are really, really important and should be, and Turkey's views are important and need to be considered by the United States and by me. However, I just disagree that the PKK and the PYD are the same. They were the same 5 years ago, but that was then. This is now. And everything that everybody here has said, in my opinion, whether it's Jim or Soner, about what you saw 5 years ago when you were in Ankara or 5 years ago when you were visiting Syria is obsolete. It's not the case anymore. The PYD has developed its own separate interests, its own separate command structure, its own separate policies. And the proof is that for the last 4 years, the PYD has kept its promise not to harm Turkey. And it would be in Turkey's interest, I think, at long last, to recognize that new reality. Now, when it comes to your point about how there are other Syrian Kurds who are not members of the PYD and that Turkey does have cordial relations with, that's absolutely right. However, the PYD is, in fact, in practice, like it or not, by far the dominant political and military force in the Kurdish regions of Syria and beyond. That's simply a fact. And in fact, Turkey itself was pleased to welcome Salah Muslim, the head of the PYD, whom I just talked with in Suleymaniye in Iraq for formal political conversations in Ankara and in other places in Turkey until as recently as 2 years ago.
Robert,
I wish that that could happen again.
thank you for those brief comments. Robert Satloff, our executive director.
Gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank you for airing this this very subtle but important policy debate
Nothing
in front
subtle
of.
about it.
Well, I think if people don't follow the alphabet soup, then they're going to lose it. But let me just ask if why. Let me ask Dave Pollock. Jim referred earlier to how the PYD went 80% toward renouncing ties with the PKK.
Yeah.
What stops the last 20%?
Okay.
And then Jim and Soner assume that the PYD does do the last 20%, and for any reasonable, objective person, it will have done whatever is necessary to clean up its act, as it were. What should the United States do vis-a-vis Turkey to urge Turkey to shift its position? Can anything be done, or is this truly beyond repair, regardless of any actions the PYD might choose to take?
All right. Well,
Asked you first, David.
yeah, right. Thank you, Rob, for that very good question. I'm not really, honestly, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I did meet, as I said, with Salah Muslim myself just last week, and we talked about things like that. And I think that probably the answer is that in his view, and by the way, he's not the real sort of brass tacks commander of the PYD inside Syria or of its military operations, but he is the official head of the movement and of the party. I think he believes that he has done as much as he needs to do, and in particular, as I keep saying, that he and his party have kept their promise not to harm Turkish interests for the last 4 years. To go beyond that and say that they have no respect for Öcalan or that they disavow their past history of partnership with the PKK or that they don't think that Kurds in Turkey deserve to have recognition and rights as an ethnic minority and so on. I think that is simply asking more than the traffic will bear for him in his internal deliberations and for the party, unless they got something for it. Now, if they were offered by Turkey or by us, or unfortunately by Russia, if they were offered something really substantial in order to formally, completely cut any remaining vestigial, emotional, historical, personal, cultural ties with the PKK, maybe they would take the bait. But that offer is not on the table.
Just to add, you are describing a situation analogous to the PLO in November 1988, where the United States had relations. Sorry, you're describing a situation where analogous to the U.S. PLO in November '88.
That's right.
Where the U.S. They did enough to have talks with us, but not enough with Israel, and we kept pressing them against their.
Right.
They didn't want to do it.
Right.
But in the end, they did.
Yeah.
Now, are you saying that they needed that the PYD is going to need this pot at the end of the rainbow, their own huge give by Ankara?
No. There are two, if I may, boss. Dispute the analogy. There are two huge differences. At your own peril. Right. Well, that's why I'm up here, I guess. There are two huge differences between these two cases. One, the PLO promised in 1988 to give up terrorism and promptly violated its promise with terrorist acts less than 2 years later. That is not the case with the PYD. The PYD has kept its promise for 4 years, all right? It's not forever, it's not perfect, but it's a very good record. That's one big difference. Second big difference is that unlike the case of Israel and the PLO, the Turkish government has already had formal discussions with the PYD and with its leader in person, in public, at very senior levels. So that taboo has already been broken, and therefore I think it would take less convincing by the United States if the PKK issue were to enter into a period of greater calm and less violence, and if Erdogan had already achieved some of his internal political objectives in Turkey. I don't think it would take much convincing for the United States to turn to Turkey and say, now it's time for you not to begin, but to restore your relationship with the PYD.
Yeah, I think that the U.S. could, obviously, because we were very, very helpful with indirectly in the period when the Erdogan government and the PKK, through various intermediaries, were negotiating and had a ceasefire that we saw in our interest, and we thought it was in Turkey's interest. We could return to that policy, and it's even easier, to the extent anything's easy, to try to pitch the PYD because, as David said, it isn't engaged in armed conflict with Turkey. But this will require two prerequisites. One is, and now I'm reaching, into the trash heap of history to find the game book, and I would start citing the master of it, Dick Holbrooke, and basically say, but that's only if we, the United States, get in with both feet and say, look, we got everybody's back. You're all going to get 60 to 70% of what you want, and we'll decide which 60 or 70%. You're going to be happy because right now you're not getting anything and you're trashing the entire region. And boy, that's more true in the Middle East even than the Balkans. And I think there would be a receptivity to that, but I don't think we have credibility. I don't think we're going to do it. The second thing is we're not sure. Normally in dealing with allied leaders, be it Margaret Thatcher, or Tony Blair, Giscard, or de Gaulle, or whatever, we sometimes think they're mistaken in how they perceive their country's interests, but we're pretty sure that their priorities are country's interests. I think President Erdogan's priority is to become president for life of Turkey with a changed constitution. And he's seen what happens when he pitches that in June and when he pitches a security threat from the Kurds in November. So I'm not sure, even if we tried to take this, what would be now a big step for us, it would achieve what we want to achieve with Turkey. It's worth trying, though. I think why not? I think that we would be in a better position vis-a-vis Erdogan if we could make that pitch.
I'll take from where Jim left. It's worth trying. So there are two trajectories, I think, for PYD moving forward. One is that it will use Russian support and work with the regime to connect its entities in Syria to have one contiguous zone that will have some sort of Russian backing internationally. Maybe the Russians will recognize it as they recognize South Ossetia. Maybe they won't, as the case of Transnistria, but it will fall somewhere between Crimea and Transnistria of having Russian protection, and that's the path we want to avoid from the perspective of our collective interest. Now, the other path, that's where I take from Jim, that we should try, and there I agree with you, Rob, on the PLO analogy, boss, is that if the United States made its continued cooperation with PYD entirely conditional on the PYD relinquishing its ties to the PKK, that's the only way this break will happen. But it also requires a conversation with Erdogan and with the Turkish elites that if they don't take this offer, they will have a Russian-controlled entity to the south of their border, and Turkey's Kurdish problem will be internationalized forever, and they cannot resolve it. So I think it does require bringing Turkey on board with this very explicit threat of, if you don't take this deal, you will have Russian threat. Russia is now Turkey's neighbor to the north in Crimea, Turkey's neighbor to the east in Armenia. Armenia has just folded its airspace into Russia. Turkey's neighbor to the south in Latakia, and they don't want them to be neighbors also in Rojava. So I think there is a path going forward, but it requires the U.S. to have a determined attitude towards PYD to start it, to say, this is it, 100% relinquishing of all ties to the PKK as a precondition for normalization with Turkey.
Unfortunately, we are out of time today. It's been a fast and furious debate, but we would be remiss without giving you a little bit of homework. And I mentioned earlier we have a forthcoming study by Barak Barfi, which will be shortly coming out, on this, I think, rather embarrassing episode in the Aleppo countryside between U.S.-backed groups. But not only that, about U.S. PYD policy, which I think, from my initial reading, is extremely nuanced and will take us a good step beyond this debate today. So I would like to thank all of our panelists here today. And thanks to all of you for coming out.